Thank you very much, Gerard. First, for being a very gracious host and also for introducing me so generously. In the last 2 days, both Gerard and Komas have been such good hosts, and it's quite clear to me that Malaysia is actually truly Asia. So, thank you. Let me also thank Suhakam, Kita, and Pusat Komas for organizing this very important conference, and congratulate you for bringing together such a diverse and important group of participants to this meeting. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure to be among you today in my capacity as Special Rapporteur on contemporary forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. I'm very grateful for the invitation to attend this important national conference, and I would like to congratulate you all for your work and contributions to the fight against racial discrimination and related intolerance. I see cooperation with the civil society actors as key in the fulfillment of my mandate. I already have had the privilege to meet with the civil society actors in Europe, in the US, and in Africa, and it's an honor, and in Latin America, and it's an honor for me to meet with members of the civil society in Asia. As I stated before the Human Rights Council in June, racism is a complex and multidimensional issue that requires a comprehensive approach to address its political, economic, social, and cultural aspects. In such a comprehensive approach, the importance and value of preventive measures cannot be overemphasized. Indeed, preventive measures are essential in challenging and correcting attitudes and ideas that are based on racial and cultural hierarchies. We must think more about prevention and in light of some of the key contemporary global challenges such as conflicts and terrorism. Indeed, it has been recognized by the United Nations General Assembly that ethnic, national, and religious discrimination are among the conditions conducive to the spread of terrorism. Furthermore, early signs of racism that may lead to conflicts and grave human rights violations, including genocide and ethnic cleansing, are not always sufficiently considered and assessed. Yet the impact of preventive measures may be decisive in avoiding the emergence and resurgence of ethnic conflicts and tensions that may lead to dramatic loss of life and other human rights violations. Poverty is also a major contemporary challenge in the fight against racism. As stated in the outcome document of Durban Review Conference, poverty, underdevelopment, marginalization, social exclusion, and economic disparities contribute to vulnerability of particular groups and persistence of racist attitudes and practices. Measures to prevent racism should therefore also focus on the promotion of equality in the enjoyment of economic, social, and cultural rights, and take into account the convergence between racism and poverty, especially in the context of the current global economic and financial crisis. Indeed, the negative impact of the current crisis in terms of budget cuts in social benefits, rising poverty and unemployment has in some countries contributed to an increase in extremist political parties, movements, and groups inciting racial discrimination and hatred. In some countries, their electoral success has increased, with some gaining additional seats in national parliaments. In this context, vulnerable groups, including, among others, members of minorities, people of African descent, refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants have been the victims of hate crimes. I wish to recall that impunity for crimes motivated by racism leads to their recurrence. Ensuring justice for the victims is therefore essential. Those responsible for racist crimes should be prosecuted and adequately sanctioned, and the victims provided with effective remedies. Furthermore, it is of concern that mainstream political parties have in some instances also embraced the openly racist and nationalistic rhetoric of extremist political parties. I therefore reiterate that respect for human rights, democracy, and the rule of law should be the cornerstone of any program or activity developed by political parties. I emphasize the importance of public denunciation of expressions of intolerance, racism, and xenophobia by party leaders. Indeed, political leaders and political parties have an important responsibility to explicitly and strongly condemn all political messages that disseminate ideas based on racial superiority or hatred and that incite racial discrimination or xenophobia. They are therefore encouraged to promote multiculturalism within their societies, as well as tolerance and mutual understanding and respect. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm concerned that xenophobic attacks on foreigners, migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers is a predictable trend in many parts of the world, particularly when the economic situation deteriorates. And this phenomenon and trend should be therefore carefully addressed by all actors. As stated in my report to the Human Rights Council, the burden of the negative consequences of the financial and economic crisis has been manipulated by politicians against vulnerable groups, including foreigners, migrants, and irregular migrants, as well as refugees and asylum seekers. These groups have been labeled a threat to the standard of living of the general population and blamed for the rise in unemployment and the state debt. Some mainstream political parties, similarly to extremist political parties, have repeatedly based their electoral campaigns on the rhetoric of national identity, threats posed by foreigners and migrants to the economy, employment, security, and national identity. As stated in the Durban Declaration, xenophobia against nationals, particularly migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers, constitutes one of the main sources of contemporary forms of racism and human rights violations. In this regard, I am concerned over human rights violations in some regions against migrant workers, including those who are in an irregular situation. They are often employed in dangerous and poorly paid jobs and exposed to ill treatment, exploitation, trafficking, and smuggling, all which aggravate their vulnerability. Furthermore, in some regions, children work as domestic workers under hazardous conditions which interfere with the enjoyment of their rights, including the right to education. It is therefore important that states enact laws and establish procedures to safeguard the rights of migrants and migrant domestic workers. Migrants should be guaranteed an effective access to legal remedies and obtain adequate reparations for any damage suffered as a result of racism and xenophobic behavior. This means that states have to undertake measures to ensure that they are aware of their rights and the assistance they can benefit in the host country. Furthermore, I recall that the Durban Program of Action urges states to review and revise, where necessary, the immigration laws, policies, and practices so that they are free of racial discrimination and are compatible with the state's obligations and international human rights instruments. I also encourage states, as stressed in the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, to participate in regional dialogues on migration and invite them to consider negotiating bilateral and regional agreements on migrant workers which comply with international human rights standards, and to design and implement programs with the states of other regions to protect the rights of these migrants. I would also like to highlight the current trend in some countries to consider matters relating to asylum in the context of the fight against irregular migration and prevention of abuse of the asylum system. As a result of this approach, restrictive measures continue to be adopted and implemented in some countries. The manner in which the detention policy applying to foreigners, including asylum seekers apprehended for unlawful entry or stay, is being implemented in some countries is a major challenge. Cases of harsh conditions of detention of asylum seekers and irregular migrants, including ill treatment in immigration detention facilities, prolonged periods of administrative detention without access to effective remedies to challenge the detention, are particularly concerning. I'm also concerned that in some instances, asylum seekers and refugee women have been prosecuted for immigration-related offenses and detained in immigration detention centers or deported for this reason. It is crucial that states ensure that their legislation and policies are in line with international human rights standards and integrate a gender approach in this context. I recall that the Durban Program of Action urges states to ensure that migrants, regardless of their immigration status, detained by public authorities, are treated with humanity and in a fair manner and receive effective legal protection, and that the police and immigration authorities treat migrants in a dignified and non-discriminatory manner in accordance with international standards. Combating and preventing racism is a primary responsibility of states. In this regard, I encourage states to adopt key measures, including national action plans that incorporate prevention strategies, collection of ethnically disaggregated data, establishment and support to anti-discrimination specialized agencies, bodies and mechanisms, human rights training for state agents and members of the judiciary, and special measures in conformity to international human rights standards. And I need to emphasize that special measures must be in conformity with international human rights standards. However, these measures cannot be effective if not implemented in an inclusive manner. Indeed, meaningful and effective participation of discriminated and marginalized groups in decision-making processes, economic, social, cultural, political, and public life is essential. And therefore, it's very important to see in all public offices and in all public institutions the diversity of all states represented. The effective participation of women who face multiple forms of discrimination and the integration of a gender perspective is also of utmost importance. Furthermore, various partners should be involved in the elimination of racism, including civil society organizations, political parties, national human rights institutions, the media, and private actors. While prevention is key in the elimination of racism, equal emphasis should be laid on enforcement. Both are complementary. And in this regard, as stated in my report to the Human Rights Council, monitoring and reporting on progress in addressing the challenges of racism is important for meaningful prevention and enforcement. States have an obligation to those within their jurisdiction, as well as to the international community, to report on such progress, particularly through the Universal Periodic Review process of the Human Rights Council, and in reports to the relevant treaty bodies, including the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. As highlighted before the General Assembly 2 weeks ago, the Internet is a new complex challenge that the states face in prevention and elimination of racism. Indeed, it is undoubtedly one of the most important vehicles by which individuals exercise their right to freedom of expression. Insidiously, however, the Internet has also become a new arena for spreading of racist ideas, dissemination of racist ideologies, incitement to racial hatred, and recruitment of new members by extremist political parties, movements, and groups. Notwithstanding this exploitation of the Internet, I am of the view that the Internet and social media can be a useful preventive tool in combating racism. And I think this morning we have seen a reference to social media like Twitter in the campaign for ratification of ISAT. I therefore encourage states to use the opportunities provided by new technologies, including the Internet, to combat racism and promote equality. Promoting freedom of speech and diversity of voices using the Internet remains an effective approach to combating racism. States should therefore adopt effective and concrete policies and strategies to make the Internet widely available, accessible, and affordable to all. In other words, we need to encourage the diversity of voices on all forms of digital media as part of encouraging good speech so as to combat bad speech. I also believe that a possible way of countering racism on the Internet is through content diversification, in particular by promoting local content. I would like to emphasize that any measures taken to counter racism on the Internet should comply with international human rights law. In particular, they should not unduly limit the right to freedom of expression and opinion. Any restriction, control, and censorship of the content disseminated via the internet should be done on a clearly defined legal basis and in a manner that is necessary, proportionate, and compatible with the state's international human rights obligations. In other words, we need to be very careful on any measures that attempt to restrict content disseminated on the internet so as not to encroach on other freedoms such as the freedom of expression. To conclude, I would like to recall that preventing and combating racism and racial discrimination also requires a solid legal framework. As such, states should ratify and incorporate into their legislation the relevant international human rights instruments, including the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. And in this respect, I would like to congratulate all those who are working towards ratification of this important convention. Furthermore, I encourage states in cooperation with civil society to develop and implement policy measures that would duly take into account the structural dimension of racism and racial discrimination, consider the interrelation between discrimination, socioeconomic marginalization, and political exclusion, and pay due attention to the situation of vulnerable groups. In this regard, I reiterate that any policy measure should ensure that all victims of racism are treated equally and receive the same attention and protection. It is indeed essential to avoid establishing any hierarchy amongst different manifestations of discrimination, even if they may vary in nature and degree depending on the historical, geographical, and cultural context. All forms of racism and discrimination must be addressed with the same emphasis and the same determination. Finally, I would like to reiterate that education in general and human rights education in particular remain a key tool in countering racism, xenophobia, and racial discrimination. I would like to emphasize that given the role of education as an enabler for the enjoyment of other rights, promoting the realization of the right to education for victims of racism is also an important means in combating and preventing racism, in challenging racist stereotypes and attitudes, and ending mobility from poverty and exclusion. I therefore encourage states to continue to invest in education in order to transform attitudes and correct ideas of racial hierarchies and superiority. In this regard, I encourage in particular the study of minorities' languages and the teaching of their history and cultures. Sports could also play a key role in promoting respect for diversity, tolerance, and mutual understanding. I recall that the Durban Declaration and Program of Action and the outcome document of the Durban Review Conference and the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination should be used by states as a comprehensive tool in the implementation of their whole inclusive agenda. And with those remarks, I thank you for your attention and participation in this important conference, and I again congratulate the organizers for this very, very important platform. Thank you.